Hello, and welcome to our video on Punnett Squares and pedigrees. These tools are used to predict the probability of offspring inheriting specific traits from their parents. Punnett squares are diagrams used to predict the possible genotypes of offspring from a cross between two individuals. Genotype refers to the genetic makeup of an individual, while phenotype refers to the physical expression of that genotype. Red and white are two of the phenotypes for eye color of fruit flies. Red eyes are dominant over white eyes. Two genotypes can result in red eyes, capital R, small r, and capital R, capital R. Only one genotype results in white eyes, small r, small r. Here are some important terms you'll need to understand and use to predict the probability of various traits in offspring. An allele is a different version of a gene, like different versions of the same recipe that can lead to variations in trait, like eye color or height. Homozygous means having two identical copies of a gene, like two copies for blue eyes, while heterozygous means having two different copies of a gene, like one blue and one brown eye. A dominant trait is one that will always be expressed if an individual inherits even one copy of the allele, the version of the gene, for that trait, while a recessive trait will only be expressed if an individual inherits two copies of the allele for that trait. To use a Punnett square, you need to know the genotypes of the parents. The possible gametes, sperm and egg cells of each parent are written along the top and side of the square. The possible genotypes of the offspring are then written in the boxes within the square. One letter from one parent and one letter from the other parent fill each box. For example, let's say you want to predict the possible genotypes of offspring from a cross between two red-eyed fruit flies, one with genotype capital R, capital R, homozygous dominant for red eyes, and the other with the genotype small r, homozygous recessive for white eyes. The Punnett square would look like this. As you can see, all the offspring in this cross would have the genotype capital R, small r, meaning they are heterozygous. This means that all the offspring would have red eyes, even though they carry a recessive allele for white eyes. Pedigrees are diagrams used to trace the inheritance of a trait through a family. Pedigrees can be used to determine the genotype of individuals in a family, as well as to predict the probability of offspring inheriting a particular trait. Pedigrees are typically drawn as a series of squares and circles, with lines connecting them to represent family relationships. The first generation appears at the top of the chart, and each younger generation appears one level lower from the top. Males are represented by squares, and females are represented by circles. The shading of the squares and circles can indicate whether an individual has the trait of interest. For example, a shaded square represents an individual with recessive genetic disorder, while an unshaded square represents an individual without the disorder. A half-shaded square indicates a carrier of the disorder, and the individual does not show the disorder. Punnett squares and pedigrees can be used to predict the probability of offspring inheriting a particular trait. For example, if you know the genotypes of the parents in a pedigree, you can use a Punnett square to predict the possible genotypes of their offspring. Looking at the original parents and only their offspring from a pedigree chart, we can see both parents are heterozygous dominant and do not show the disorder, but are both carriers. 3 of their offspring do not show the disorder, with only one of these individuals being a carrier, the one with capital A and small a. One individual has a disorder, small a, small a. This is the Punnett square for these parents. Note that the square predicts one individual will be homozygous dominant, capital A, 2 heterozygous dominant, capital A, small a, and 1 homozygous recessive, small a, and this individual will show the disorder. Remember, Punnett squares predict the probability of the offspring genotypes, but do not guarantee the outcomes. In this case, the predicted offspring outcomes were not as predicted. Punnett squares and pedigrees are powerful tools that can be used to understand the inheritance of traits. By understanding these tools, you can make informed decisions about your family's own health history. I hope you enjoyed this video on Punnett squares and pedigrees. Thank you for watching.